What comes up for you when you think about vulnerability? Or if you hear somebody talking about vulnerability, maybe even me, what do you notice coming up? Are there thoughts, ideas? Maybe there's sensations in your body? Most of us have an idea. It's a cultural and societal thing that weakness and vulnerability go together. That any sense of vulnerability equals weakness. And that weakness makes it likely that you will be hurt or something bad will happen. But there is another part of vulnerability that is so incredibly important. And that's what I want to talk about today. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're new, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. So I've talked about vulnerability so many times in so many ways over the years, but I wanted to talk about this today, maybe in a little bit of a different way, but because of something that just came up in my group. And in my course, Journey to Wholeness for Healing from Childhood Sexual Trauma, one of the mantras that I share is vulnerability is my greatest strength. So before I even go on, just take a moment and notice what your reaction is to that mantra. Vulnerability is my greatest strength. It's very natural for people to have a strong reaction to that, again, because we look at vulnerability as weakness. We experience vulnerability as traumatic. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance that that has been your lived experience. But vulnerability is not weakness, first of all. Under any circumstance, it is not weakness. But there are certainly circumstances that can leave us vulnerable. As women, we are inherently more vulnerable, generally speaking, than men. Somebody who has some sort of cognitive disability is more vulnerable in a lot of types of circumstances. Somebody who is a person of color and they're going into an environment that is predominantly the majority, that creates a vulnerable situation. Just as survivors going into a relationship, just generally, not even considering what kind of relationship or anything else, just going into a relationship, allowing yourself to go into a relationship, that is naturally, inherently vulnerable. Trying something new, if you lack self-confidence, is inherently vulnerable. Now, if you don't lack self-confidence, it isn't really vulnerable because you're not the aftermath of not doing exceedingly well isn't going to have a negative impact on you. But vulnerability can look a lot of different ways. But in order to create the life that we want, the relationships, the experiences, the feelings, we have to be willing to be vulnerable, right? Healing happens in connection. Well, the only way to have true connection is by being vulnerable. It's as simple as that. Obviously, there's a lot more complexity in it, but that is the reality. Allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, it takes a lot. And that's one of the reasons why healing takes so much courage, why it is such an incredibly courageous journey. Because of the vulnerability. If you didn't feel vulnerable, it wouldn't take courage. So I think it is important that we shift away from looking at vulnerability purely as being a bad or negative thing, and certainly as a weakness, because it is never weakness. the person that has cognitive disabilities, the person of color, women, whatever the situation is, that's not a weakness. I'm not weak because I'm a woman, but I am vulnerable because I'm a woman. I wasn't weak because I struggled with self-worth, but struggling with self-worth made me vulnerable to feeling really hurt in situations, to even choosing to be in relationship with people that were more likely to hurt me. That is vulnerability. That is not weakness. So, we're looking at vulnerability as a strength. If you think about what it takes to start healing, to acknowledge within yourself your reality, your feelings, your needs, your desires, your real lived experience, what you've been in denial or have minimized for so long, that's vulnerable. Because you're opening yourself up to feeling the pain, to feeling the hurt, to feeling feelings that you have worked masterfully at avoiding or masking. So to open yourself up, to open that door, is incredibly vulnerable. And it is absolutely the opposite of weakness. A weak person is not going to choose to open that door. A weak person is not going to choose to tell somebody how they feel. Yes, it creates vulnerability. Because when you do that, when you tell somebody how you feel, you are risking that person minimizing your feelings. You're risking that person telling you that you're crazy, that you're overreacting, or that you're being silly. That is a risk, without a doubt. And if that happens, it can be incredibly hurtful. And depending on where you are in your healing, it could be devastating. But sharing how you feel with somebody not only opens the door for you to honor yourself, to express, to use your voice, to express yourself, to be seen, which is important. It allows an opportunity for that person to be with you in it. And when that person can be with you in it, and yes, there are people who can't be there with you in it. I'm talking about choosing people that have given us a reason to believe that this might be a person that you can share with. And whether that's a therapist or a friend, or potentially even a stranger, depending on what it is, what the situation is. When you do that, when you allow yourself to be seen or supported, you are giving that person an opportunity to meet you there, to be kind and accepting, to be supportive, to just listen. And when you give yourself that opportunity and it is met in an appropriate way, it's still vulnerable, but there's healing that happens in that. There's healing that happens in that because you realize that vulnerability doesn't have to equal being hurt. There's healing because you're creating connection with another being. You're feeling connected to them and they are feeling connected to you. Even if it's not an ongoing relationship, right? Healing happens in moments. You've heard me say that too. In that moment, even if that's the only time it happens, assuming that nothing bad happens in that relationship, that moment is healing. And the more you are able to practice that, the more healing happens. And it's not just about relationship. Like if you think about something that you've been thinking about doing, and it could be something like sharing something with somebody, but it could be something more about like a new hobby you'd like to try, an adventure you'd like to take, a new recipe, maybe. If you keep yourself from doing that because what if it just doesn't turn out? What if something bad happens and you keep yourself from doing it? Yes, you're not risking vulnerability, so you are protecting yourself in that way, but you're also really limiting how you live your life, the opportunities for joy, connection, excitement, and a really important one, missing an opportunity to be able to experience yourself in a way that you may not have believed possible. Like maybe you are a good cook. Maybe you really do have this wild, adventurous side. You just never allowed yourself to follow it. Maybe you really do feel deeply settled in authentic connection. Maybe you realize that it's something that feels so profound and you've kept yourself from being able to experience it throughout your life because you didn't want to feel vulnerable. Vulnerability is our greatest strength in this process because we choose. We make a conscious decision to choose to be vulnerable. And an example of that is in my groups, generally speaking, I will share a post where I encourage people to really just check within and notice what is present. Maybe what needs to be witnessed, what wants to be heard, how we can be supported, and how we can be celebrated and honored. So there's an opportunity to just check within and notice what is present. And then in sharing that within the group, which is vulnerable, right? But it's intentional vulnerability within a safe container. And yes, in the very beginning, you don't trust that it's safe. But as time goes on, and this is true outside of a group too, so I'm not just talking about group here, but when you allow yourself to practice that, you get to experience that not only can it be okay and not be a really bad thing, but you get to experience the positive, the good things that come from vulnerability. Healing happens because you've been vulnerable and decided to do the work it takes. You've decided to reach out to somebody and ask for support. You show up in vulnerable ways by setting a boundary or by asking for what you need, by taking care of yourself in ways that might feel uncomfortable. All of that is vulnerable. But all of that, choosing to be vulnerable in those ways, is how you heal. Without the vulnerability, you stay exactly where you were, if not struggling even more in some ways. Because the longer we struggle with feeling or thinking that it's weakness, or the longer we struggle with isolation and shame, the more impact it has over time. So being able to see that vulnerability in the right places with the right people, choosing it consciously, that is the path to everything that you desire to be different in your life. Your relationships, how you feel day to day, what you do with your time, whether it's work or free time. How many times do you hold yourself back thinking, oh, I'd really like to try that. That sounds so interesting or exciting or intriguing. Or you hear somebody talk about an experience they've had with another person and you think, wow, it would be incredible if I could feel that, or if I could do that, if I could put myself out there like that. Well, you can. It's not easy. And I want to be clear. I'm not saying it's just, oh, just choose vulnerability and everything's going to be fine. Choosing vulnerability is not easy, which is, again, where the courage comes from. It's being able to feel like you can assure yourself that, yes, it is a risk, but the reward of that risk really can't be measured. But the key is conscious vulnerability, intentional vulnerability, making sure that you're doing it in situations with people that make sense. So even if it's something like trying a new adventure, like bungee jumping, right? So you might feel terrified to do it and think of all the reasons that you shouldn't. So putting yourself out there and deciding, okay, I'm going to do this, obviously that feels incredibly vulnerable, right? So you are putting your trust in the equipment, the place, whatever. But you're probably doing that very intentionally. Hopefully you looked up reviews, you understand how it works, you understand the dangers, potential dangers, but you also understand the likelihood of that not happening. But you've looked into it, right? So you're making a conscious choice to do that. You think that the reward, the exhilaration, the accomplishment, whatever, feels worth it. And I am not at all suggesting that bungee jumping has to be that thing. I will never, I feel pretty confident that I can say, I will likely never bungee jump. That's not where I feel the need to be vulnerable. But if it's something that I really wanted to do, then I would try to find a way to recognize, to allow myself to accept that the vulnerability does not mean that I shouldn't do it. That the vulnerability means that I'm weak, which will bring up shame, which will cause me to not do it. Being able to honor the truth of our vulnerability and what it takes to allow ourselves to be vulnerable can actually be a really pretty significant part of connecting to the truth of our worthiness, of believing in ourselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and please do share in the comments what did come up for you thinking about vulnerability. What do you think about the mantra, vulnerability is my greatest strength? Because when you choose it, when you allow yourself to be vulnerable and put yourself in situations to experience something you never imagined possible for your life, it really is pretty amazing what can happen. And again, I want to be clear that I'm not saying every time you choose vulnerability, it's going to turn out wonderful. Because depending on what that situation is or who you're choosing to be vulnerable with, you could end up feeling hurt. And that's why it is important to do it consciously. Has this person shown you that they are capable, that they are worthy of you sharing with them? And if we think about a romantic partner, the first person who says, I love you, that is incredibly vulnerable. But if the other person is somebody who feels so much self-doubt that they would never say, I love you first, if both people struggled with that and nobody would ever say it, what would happen to that relationship? So being able to be vulnerable enough to do something, and in that situation to say I love you to somebody, that opens a door to take that relationship to a place it could never go otherwise. If one of those people wasn't willing to be vulnerable. And that applies to so many areas of our lives. Thanks so much for watching. Share your thoughts below. And again, if you're new, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. And if you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can find it too. Thanks so much for watching. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.